In this chapter, we will be talking about Modo's interface. So to start, I should say that Modo's interface is very fluid. You can change it to anything you want very quickly. And if you ever are looking at anybody else's tutorials and their interface changes, it's actually quite okay. So let me demonstrate some of these quick changes. If I don't like this single viewport, if I need more views to work with, I can very easily press and hold Control. I can hover over my mouse over this orange dot, and then I can left click while still holding Control, hold, and drag my mouse to the right. And let go. When you let go, you'll notice that you now have two viewports. I can do the same thing if I, for example, press and hold Control, left click and drag downwards this time on this orange dot and let go, and now I have three viewports. So even though that there are configurations for this that you can get out of Modo that have been pre-configured for you, you can also make your own at any given time. If I wanted to delete this, or if I want to change this into a different kind of menu, not only a 3D viewport, I could very easily just go to something like this, and now I have a different kind of menu. I can once again click on this triangle here, click here, change it to whatever, and get all sorts of like different kind of properties. I can change it to a graph editor, anything I want really. And if I wanted to undo these actions, what I have to do is I have to go to this orange dot. Sometimes it's a little triangle that's in the very corner tip of the menu, but in this case, this menu here has a dot. So if I right click on this and then I press delete, or if I click on delete, then I can delete that viewport type. Now, as I've mentioned before, Modo's interface is very flexible. So, for example, if I take my cursor and I move it between the viewport and the Modo tools form, if I left click and drag to the left and right, you'll notice that the interface is changing slightly. The icons are stretching, they're getting a little bit bigger, and they're collapsing to the point where if you go too far, eventually some of the icons start disappearing and they end up being hidden away behind another menu. Now, left clicking and dragging left or right, these arrow buttons don't work as effectively as when you collapse vertically. So when you do it horizontally, it's not quite as good. So if I click on this button, you'll have one pop up, then you'll have another pop up, and now you have the next set of icons. So I have to click again and again to get hopefully the rest of the menu. In this case, it doesn't really work. So like I said, this way it doesn't work as well. But if I try to vertically shrink this list, and then I press this arrow button to expand the missing tools to show me more tools that are in this menu, I can left click on this, and now you'll notice that the rest of the tools are in fact being hidden away in this menu. If I go down, and let's hide everything up to extrude, and then I left click on this button, you'll notice that extrude is the first tool and it includes everything below. If I keep going up and I press this button, you'll notice that more and more tools are being hidden away, and I'm able to access these by just clicking this arrow. This works in a number of menus. If I go to properties, you'll notice that not all the properties are visible, so I can left click on this and get the access to the rest of the tools. Some menus collapse. So if I take this item list and if I hover over with my mouse between the item list and the properties, and then I move my mouse up, you'll notice that the item list seems to change. And if I keep going, it's going to change some more. So Modo's interface really is very adaptable. And the cool thing is that some of these menus are so well built that they never really take away any kind of functionality from you, regardless if they're collapsed or not. So in this case, I have the vertex map list, and if I open up the UV maps, I'll notice that there's map 1 in brackets 2, texture, and texture. And then I have the new UV map button. So if I click on this, I can actually create or get a new pop-up window, and I can create a new UV map altogether. Now, if I left click between the tool pipe and the vertex map list, and if I left click and drag up, you'll notice that it changes slightly. Now, under UV map, I have this thing here, and it tells me that my currently selected UV map is texture. So if I click on this, you'll notice that I now have I can select none, I can select any one of these, or I can create a new one. So even though this vertex map list has been collapsed slightly and reconfigured for you, I can still create a new UV map. At the same time, if I keep going, you'll notice that once again it has collapsed and adapted itself to its new size. So now this menu works slightly differently, where I have to actually select my type of UV or vertex map first, and then I am given access to a list of maps that are related to this one. So in this case, U means UV map, and I'm given a list of UV maps right in here. And at the same time, once again, notice I can actually create new UV maps even though this list has been collapsed that much. Some menus are not as flexible. This one is just a list, this pipeline. So if I left click and drag, you'll notice that nothing's really changing to this list. Statistics, it's also a list, so it doesn't really collapse very well. The only thing that changes is that this slider gets slightly bigger or smaller depending on the size of this list, so you can very easily scroll through this list. Command history reveals more tools, so the menu can be collapsed, and at the same time you still get this bar here where you can type in commands. So depending on which type of form you're trying to collapse, you'll get different kinds of behaviors. Just know that if you ever see any user, any Modo user, if you ever notice their setup is different from yours, or some menus look different, sometimes all it is just a case of trying to expand a menu or collapsing it, and you'll get exactly what they have. Okay, so Modo can be changed very quickly. At the same time, what it contains is tabs. So right now we are in the Model tab, and this is very heavily focused towards the process of modeling. So over here on this left-hand side, we have tools that we will be using for modeling. We have these filters or these folders to sort all the different kinds of tools. Then we have buttons for opening up more windows for all the brush-based tools. And then we have presets that Modo comes with if you install the content pack. And below here, on this lower left-hand side portion of the interface, this is the tool setting area. And right now we see nothing. And the reason for that is because we haven't actually selected any tools. So if I go back up to basic and click on cube, you'll notice that this lower left-hand side has actually changed to reflect this tool that I selected. I haven't made this tool yet, or I haven't made an object using this cube tool, but I am already given options so that if I want my new cube that I'm going to draw into the viewport, if I wanted to have more than one segment across, then I can preset those settings and then draw my cube. At the same time, if I press sphere, you'll notice that it changed to sphere and it gives me all the related options here. If I go to cylinder, same thing, and any tools in this toolbar. Now, on this right-hand side, I have the object level stuff. So in this item list, items are objects more or less. You have meshes, so any kind of geometry. You have your cameras and directional lights and things like that. And you also have locators for grouping objects. And if you want to see the list of objects that you can add into Modo, you can very easily just go to add item. And here you have all the different types of objects that you can add into Modo. Now, much like the left-hand side where I was clicking on tools and I was getting the tool settings in this portion, the right-hand portion that deals with the objects also has its own property tab. And it gives you all the properties for this selected object. If I select my camera, you will notice that now this whole thing has changed. I now have projection type perspective or orthographic or spherical or cylindrical. And then I have all the focal length options and things like that. If I make this larger, you're going to get more settings for this tool. And at the same time, if I shrink it, you'll notice these two arrows at the bottom, because what happens is Modo's menus are collapsible, so I can click on this arrow button and I'm going to get the rest of the list of the options for this tool. At the same time, some object types have multiple folders. So for example, you have a camera view, you have camera effects, so you can add motion blur and depth of field and all those things. Then you have user custom channels and tags and things like that. So this side deals with mostly the object level things, but the properties isn't only linked to the item list, it's also linked to shading. So anything that I select in the shading tab over here, if I select render, it's going to give me all the settings like resolution, your frames that you're going to be rendering, your DPI and things like that. You're also going to get settings for anti-aliasing and things like that, or how many rays you get with reflection depth and stuff. And then you have global illumination, again, user channels for mostly animation purposes and tags. And then you have groups and clips are mostly used for images, so think of it like that. And now on the lower hand side, lower right hand side, you have channels, which are again mostly used for animation purposes and sometimes rendering. And then you have display. Display is well, first of all, you have to select something, and this allows you to display objects differently. So if I have this object, I think it's going to be better if I select the hammer. So I know for a fact that I've selected the hammer, even though all of them are called mesh, because I can see the wireframe here. And my active objects currently are set to show a wireframe, and my background objects are set not to show any wireframe at all. So if I have this object selected and then I click on bounding box, it's going to replace that object with a box. Now, it's not intuitive when you're modeling, but when you are putting together a scene and you're about to render this very, very big scene with lots and lots of models, sometimes it's better to click on this property for a bunch of objects to only display them as bounding boxes. So what this does is it doesn't actually fully replace the original object. The original object is still there. However, inside of the Modo viewport, it gets replaced with a box. And the reason for that is because it's a lot easier to render a cube for the video card rather than all these polygons here. Now, this is a very low resolution object, but imagine you have a 5 million polygon object and then you have several copies. It's a lot easier if you click on all those objects and click on bounding box to replace them with just a regular bounding box. When you render, however, the full object is going to be rendered. As you can see here, I am rendering, even though inside of the viewport, the actual object is not being rendered on the video card, but the final render does in fact include the actual hammer. So if I turn it back to off, you'll notice that the hammer has in fact disappeared. So I can just click on off and I get the original hammer back. Now, lists is actually a very, very important menu, and this one deals with several things, one of which is all sorts of maps that can be attached to your objects. Weight maps, subdivision maps, UV maps are probably the most important in this list in terms of modeling and texturing. So these, you can see a list of 2 different UV maps, and if you want to see how they look, I can go into up in these tabs, I can click on UV, and then I can see that this object, this hammer, has in fact got a UV layout that looks like this. So this is map 2. If I go back to map 1, it's very messy and it's useless. So I can manage my maps over here in my lists. If I just right click and delete, it will delete map number 1, and now I just have map number 2. And I could also do things like double click in here, or just click once to select it and then click again to rename, and then I could rename it to something else like texture. Enter, and there you go. There's all sorts of other maps that are not really useful for you, except maybe morph maps. Morph maps are used for changing your object and storing that changed state. So if you have a character and you have a number of faces, facial expressions, like a smile or a sad face or an open mouth or something like that, then this is exactly where you would store it. You would save morph maps over here. So you could just left click and you can choose either relative or absolute morph map, create, and now you have a state for this object. Below here you have the pipeline area, and this area deals with changing certain properties for your tools. So if I press T, I get the soft select tool. So I can soft select like this. Now you notice one thing is that I can select and certain parts of my tool are invisible. So like, let's just say if I don't want this handle, right? Let me just undo that. I could easily go into the pipeline area, go to the V means visible. I can make the transform handle invisible. So I can now focus on right-clicking and seeing the element fall off, this thing right here, this circle around where I'm right-clicking and dragging my mouse. And now I could change my model without being distracted by these handles that used to be here. So I can easily disable them. I can change the evaluation. And then the lower part, which is very, very useful, especially when you're finalizing models or when you want to find things quickly on your model. Let's just say I want to select all the triangles on this hammer. I can very quickly go into the statistics portion of the interface, go to, well, usually this is closed. So if I open up the polygons, because I want to select the triangles, so I will expand this by clicking on the triangle. I will then go into vertex, and how many vertices does this polygon have? Well, a triangle will have 3, so if I press this plus, Modo will automatically select all the triangles on this model. This is very handy when you're trying to select all n-gons, and n-gons are polygons that have more than 4 vertices, so more than 4 points. And the reason why you want to do that is, and in this case this model has 0, but let's just say if I try to do something like very quickly do something like that, so I added a number of edges at the expense of creating a few n-gons. So if I select all the points around this polygon, you'll now notice that there's 5 points, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? So we have 2 n-gons in this case because we have one on this side of the model and we also have one over here. So how do I quickly select these? Right now I know exactly where these polygons are, so I could actually do it manually very quickly. But what if this model has 500,000 polygons and I have to very quickly triangulate them in order to be able to export to ZBrush and make sure everything works? Well, what I would do is I would go into this area, I would go to greater than 4, I would press plus, and I would have automatically selected polygons. So let me go back to the model interface. This is really the only thing that you're going to be using. I mean, all your modeling will really revolve around using the toolbar settings, your items, and any kind of properties in the section. At the same time, you also have at the very bottom, over on the bottom right-hand corner, you have the command history. So if I just expand that by going to this line between these two menus, so let me go over here again. If I go over at the bottom here, if I go over this line, you'll notice that my cursor changes to 2 arrows up and down. That means I can left click and drag up or down to expand or collapse this menu. And then here I have, for example, undos, and in here I can do things like see the sequence of things, my history. I also see the actual commands that are being fired from Modo whenever I do something. At the same time, sometimes Modo will collapse several actions into one. And you can also add or do things like change your hotkeys. So if I have select lasso, I can press right click and map command to key. So this allows me to change hotkeys very quickly within Modo without actually having to dig around inside of the interface somewhere unknown to the user. So this way, if you use a tool, if you like a tool, let's just say I use cube and then activate it, I will now have my tool all the way at the bottom. So tool apply, cube primitive. So in this case, when I actually selected the cube primitive, it also did the tool activation or an adjustment, right there. So whenever I select anything like sphere primitive, it'll automatically show up the sphere primitive tool. So this is an active mode, as in I have to first, in order to use it, I have to left click and drag, and then now my tool has been activated, adjusted, and again, it's been applied to the actual viewport or to the scene. This top center section here deals with mostly selecting things and changing up the way you work over here. I'll explain this in a little bit. So the selection part, these vertex, edges, polygons, materials, and items section, if I click on any one of these buttons, I can select, for example, vertices, I can select edges, I can select polygons, I can select objects based on materials or faces based on materials. So if I hover over any part of these objects here, you'll notice that a number of objects get selected or highlighted at the very least. When I select them, the actual material gets selected. Same thing if I go over here, you notice that once again, certain objects get highlighted that share materials. When I go to items, I can select individual objects. So in this case, these two cups and these handles are inside of the cup objects if you go over to the item view here. Now the action center is a little bit different. What it does is it allows me to change the way these axes, these manipulators, the way they're aligned, the way they work and things like that. So if I go to, for example, origin, and then I hit move, or press W on my keyboard, or press this button over here, you'll notice that it's always around the origin. So it doesn't matter where I select or what I select, it always appears in the same place. If I go to automatic, I press W, it gets these axes get sent directly to the center of my selection. So if I click here, I press W, you'll notice that the position of my handles always changes, which is great when you're working on, close up on something and then you press W. I have my action center exactly where I need it to be. So that's pretty much what this deals with. I have about a 30-minute chapter on action centers on its own. I also have about a 30-minute chapter on selections. Symmetry is more or less self-explanatory. If I hide most of these, except the cups, if I look down here, you'll notice that it says Z-axis, X-axis, and Y-axis. So these black lines here, where they cross, that's where the origin is. And this axis, this black line, to be more specific, is the X-axis. As you can see, this little thing tells me that it's X. Z is aligned to here. And at the same time, if I look over here, you'll notice that it says -Z. If I rotate my view around, you notice that it says +Z. So this is one of the ways that you can kind of orient yourself around in 3D space. So if I click on Symmetry X, for example, if your object is actually symmetrical, then you should be able to select one side of the model and Modo will automatically select the other side. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. Fall-offs are, they're sort of like gradients or profiles that change up the way you manipulate objects. So there's a whole bunch to choose from. I also have a chapter on this. Snapping deals with toggling on and off, snapping from one object to another. So if I want to align perfectly one object to another, I would use this. Again, there's a chapter on this. And work plane changes the way your grid is aligned to an object, so you can do things like, to give you a very quick example, if I want to create a cube on a very... Okay, so let's just say I rotate this or move it across like that. And let's just say I want to create a cube on this angle here. So what I would do is I would go over this polygon. So select polygon first, go over here, press the home keyboard button. And I'm actually going to turn off the fall off. And now I would go over to the left-hand side and create a cube. And now you notice that because of the fact that the work plane has been changed, I can now create a cube from that angle. If you want to get rid of it, press the End key. So that's pretty much what this section here does. I will want to quickly go over the different areas inside of Modo before we move on. So the next area, these tabs are just different configurations of Modo. So really, the interface is always more or less the same. The only thing that's changed is the types of menus that are available to you that have been, again, pre-configured by Luxology. So if I press Paint, Modo will change itself slightly. It'll give me all the tools that are useful for the process of painting. So here I have a bunch of presets that I can dig through. These are different kinds of brushes that I can apply to my objects. I have all my brush-based things, tools over here. Sculpt tools, paint tools, hair tools, vertex map tools, and particle tools. So all these are over here. And one thing that you might notice also right away is that unlike when I was in the model pane, I used to have a sculpt window that I could pop up. And the reason why this is here is just merely for convenience. If I want to keep my current layout and I don't want to change it, and if I just want a very quick access to my sculpt tools, I could just press this sculpt button and I have now my sculpt tools available, even though I'm in my model pane. But if I go into the Paint tab, notice that there's no longer a sculpt pane here. The reason why is because this entire window was essentially what the sculpt window was. So I have all these tools available to me now, but the modeling tools are gone. What if I need to make a quick change to my model while I am painting? Well, now you press this, and now you have all your modeling tools available to you as well. And again, presets are mostly content manager kind of stuff. And when you're painting, obviously you're going to be doing with coloring your model, so that deals with materials and textures. So it automatically puts this instead of items over here on this right-hand side of the interface. You're put into shading instead, your shader tree. And of course the properties that are related to that. So this is mostly used for painting and sculpting, anything that's related to a brush-based kind of workflow. Topo is mostly used for changing your model's topology. So topology meaning you have this wireframe that makes up this model. Imagine if you wanted to change it. In this case, this was hand modeled, so I know exactly that this specific topology is what I want. But if you import a 3D scan is very dense and not very useful to be animated because it's a very heavy mesh. Generally, so what you end up doing is you have to optimize the topology. So you will draw your own polygons on top of the scan and make a very optimized version of it. Sometimes you also might want to sculpt a concept inside of ZBrush and bring it over for the final modeling process. Again, this is where you would generally do that. So all these tools on the left-hand side have been adapted to this workflow. Also, the blue wireframe is actually a different mode of rendering your wireframe, and it's useful again for retopology. If you notice, while I am navigating, my cup is actually transparent, or rather the wireframe gets rendered over the cup. If I go back into my model view, and if I try the same, the model just disappears. So in terms of doing the topology inside of the Topo tab, because of the fact that I'm using a different rendering method, it's actually more useful towards this task. So everything has been configured towards this task for your convenience. Inside of the UV tab, this is basically an unwrap area, where you basically unwrap your models so that you can paint on these models using 2D textures. So you unwrap your model, and then you save it to hard disk or just save the scene. But at the same time, you can now import your textures into here to do the texturing, or you could actually export your UV maps as an Illustrator file that contains the entire wireframe, and then you could use that as a layer inside of Photoshop to paint on. So if you want to paint on any object, it has to be prepared for the texturing process, because you will be applying images to these objects. Once you're finished with that, you might want to go into layout. Layout is mostly used for laying out of your scenes. So this interface here, what it presents you is, again, focus tools on making your scene assemblies much more quickly. So what you have is, sure, I mean, you have the model window in case you want to model in it, but this really isn't the most efficient setup for modeling. It's mostly there for convenience. At the same time, you also have the scope menu. You no longer have presets. Now, the reason why, unlike the previous menus, which had presets here, the reason why it's not here is because the presets window is already here at the bottom. So from here, if I left click on any one of these tabs, I can open them up, and then I can left click and drag whichever objects that I want or have available to me. I can drag them, and I can very quickly populate the scene. You also have tools for cloning and mesh painting and creating quick boxes. Again, anything that will aid you with creating a quick scene setup. Once this is done, or even before this is done, we have another tab called Setup, and this is all to do with behavior. So if you want to set up, let's just say a car, your car will have turning wheels and a turning steering wheel. Perhaps when you rotate the steering wheel, the tires will automatically, or the wheels will automatically turn. So, or maybe when your car is moving back and forwards, the wheels also turn. So you have this area of the application here to basically set up any kind of behavior like that. If you have a character, you will be setting up its bones, and you will be setting up all the relational weights so that a bone can grab an area of a mesh to deform. Once this is done, once you have your character set up, once you have your any kind of objects set up for animation, then you're ready to actually go into the animation process. And in here, you would move your timeline. So this is the timeline right here. You would move your timeline to a specific time in on the timeline. You would move your object, so you would change the position of where it exists in space, and then you would keyframe that position, so that when you have a number of keyframes along your timeline, you could then play back your timeline. You could left click and drag, or press the play button, and it would go through all the frames and play your animation. Of course, once your animation is done, then you go into rendering, and inside of rendering, you're provided with anything that you need. So you have your items, you also have your shader tree open at the same time. So this configuration, once again, is different. Modo is still the same. I can actually change this to look like my model tab, if I put in some time. But everything that I have here is really focused on the rendering aspect. So I can select any object in here to move it or do whatever it is that I need, because maybe I might want to composite my scene or compose my scene just slightly differently for the final look. So I'm also given things like materials or any shading property or things here. At the same time, I'm giving the pure properties of all these objects and shading things here. As you can see, it's changing. And yeah, so basically this deals with rendering. You have anything useful for perhaps adding materials to your objects. So automatic presets for materials. You have a gradient editor, schematic for changing setups of your objects and things like that. And then you have your UV view in case you want to preview textures and your UV setup. Perhaps there might be an error somewhere, so you could use to investigate. Instead of changing back to the UV view, you might want to keep your render window and all these different menus here open, and then maybe if you notice that there's something wrong with the render, you might want to investigate if in fact the error is with the UVs. So that's pretty much the interface. I mean, the only thing that I've really missed is just these window or these menu pull downs at the top. If you just click them, you can get all the different tools that are available to you. Some of the things that I have not touched upon yet are things like changing the viewport over here. Like, let's just say if I wanted to model without any of the item lists or any of the tools, if I just want to preview my model and get a larger scope of things. More useful if I am making a scene, more so than actually making a single object. But if I press 0 on my number pad, you'll notice that my entire interface, or at least more or less, disappears and I only have a viewport available to me. Very useful if you just want to see your entire scene, perhaps do a test render, and so on. So this is one of the things. Now, one thing I should warn you about is if you have in fact been changing your interface by splitting things around and then deleting your interface or parts of your interface, that functionality might actually break. So just be wary of that. Another thing that you could do inside of Modo is if you press and hold Control and Shift and then press Tab and just move your mouse over, I could actually switch to different layouts very quickly. So if I don't want to use the tabs here, if I wanted to have a slightly bigger interface, I could very quickly just go to Model, and now you'll notice that the tabs have disappeared and my entire interface is focused on modeling only. If I press and hold Control and Shift and then press Tab again and just hover over Animate, once again my interface has changed into the animation interface, and I no longer have the tabs. So I can't mistakenly switch my tabs. Now if I go to UV Edit, you'll notice this. If I go to Setup, you'll notice that. If I go to Layout, you'll get that. Model. And of course, if I want tabbed back, I basically just have to go to Tabbed, and my tabs are once again back. I stick with this setup because I can very quickly go to any one that I want. The one problem that I see with this feature, the Shift, Control, and Tab, is that this always changes. Notice that the tab is in this location right now. This is the last used tab. If I go to Paint, now Paint is number 1, Tab is number 2. So this makes it slightly confusing to use because I can't remember all the positions of all the different tabs, and I can't just by muscle memory go into a different part of my app. Since this always changes, I can't rely on muscle memory, so I always have to be on top of my game and make sure I go to the exact tab. So it's actually a little slower to switch, I believe, than me just going to UV or Layout or Model, because I know exactly where these are and they're always in the same location. If you are finding that you're getting a little bit overwhelmed by this first chapter, I wouldn't worry about it. The reason I say that is because a lot of this stuff will be further investigated in other chapters. Like I said, there's a 30-minute chapter on selections itself. At the same time, when you start to model, you'll find that you're getting more and more familiar as a result of the fact that you are using Modo, and you're finding things, things are actually starting to click. So over time, you'll get it. Just give it some time. Follow the the rest of the chapters. Watch what it is that that I'm explaining, and eventually it'll click. So good luck and cheers.